So we were here just a few years ago.
Yeah.
Also a controversial, interesting but controversial book. But tonight's book is the premise that certain groups have been successful, we'll talk about what that means, because of three traits that you've noted. First, how did you select these groups?
Well, first, just to clear up one misunderstanding people might have had if they read something about our book in the social media. We focus on 8 groups, but there are literally dozens of groups in America today that are outperforming the national average. Dozens. We could have talked about a lot of groups. We chose the groups we did because, one, they were the largest, and their success was the easiest to measure, and in some ways the most striking.
And easiest to measure because it was economic, political.
Yeah, we're quite clear. I mean, this has been another critique out there that, you only define success by, material measures. And as you know, since you've read it, we come right out at the beginning and say, of course, success can't be equated with happiness or the best lived life or the most meaningful life. But it's very hard to measure all the various measures of success. So we choose these measures of success. That is, we look at very standard, income, median household income, educational attainment, corporate attainment, because there are statistics for those things. And those are the measures that we use.
So those were the tangibles. You chose 8 groups, and they're actually quite varied. And they are particularly immigrant groups. So could you talk a little bit about who they are? And
Yeah, let me give you one example. They're not all immigrants, but the example I'm going to give is an immigrant group, Cuban Americans. It's really a fascinating case. Hundreds of thousands of Cuban Americans came over to this country in and just after 1959, when Castro took over and imposed communism in Cuba. They came over, most of them with just $5 in their pockets because Castro had confiscated their property. Many of them had been judges, doctors, and other higher status positions in Cuba. In America, in Miami, where most of the exiles settled, they became vegetable pickers, dishwashers, and other menial laborers of that kind. Many of them working 2 jobs, 3 jobs, just to make a living, and packing into apartments, 8, 12 of them into small apartments, and facing a lot of discrimination. They found very commonly signs posted on apartment buildings in Miami that said, "No dogs, no Cubans." And the extraordinary thing is, within one generation, by 1990, their children had made it. That is, in a statistical sense, their children were twice as likely as Anglo-Americans to be making $50,000 or more. And that's by 1990. And this is just, look, it's a tough economy out there. We know inequality is rising. We know opportunity is shrinking. And yet, it's just a striking fact that there are these groups out there who are still succeeding and are making it, even though the playing field is not level. And our book is saying, let's look at those groups. I mean, can't we learn something from that?
And just as to who the groups are, they are very varied, which is why I was a little bit taken aback. I mean, because they include groups, they include 2 religious, they include Mormons and Jews. Right. Mormons are not immigrants. And whether Jews are is an interesting question we can discuss. Indian Americans, actually, one of the highest census income statistics, and Lebanese Americans, Iranian Americans, and Chinese Americans, and then Cuban Americans and Nigerian Americans. So the groups include, every race, actually, Hispanic group, an African American group. So they are very varied.
so when you looked at these groups, the thing that jumped out at you was that there were these 3 varying traits, and they occur maybe not always for the same reason. But the first of them was this idea that as a group, as a culture, or as a religious group, they have this feeling of superiority, that they are in some way chosen or above, meant for something special. So could you talk a little bit about how much of that came from the immigration, how much of that came from something embedded in the culture?
This is what I find so interesting, is that you're right. In all these cases, it's something that unites all these groups, but the specific facts are completely different. So I don't know if you want to talk about the Jews essentially invented the idea of the chosen people, and you see that trope everywhere. And it's a complex one. I mean, there's a lot of people are very uncomfortable with it.
Well, I mean, the Jewish sense of exceptionalism has changed greatly over the centuries. A lot of Jews today are uncomfortable about the chosenness idea. I would include myself in that group. But the Jewish sense of exceptionality, whether historical or as whether it's a history of thinking about morality and of intellect, some sense of exceptionality, just as a historical matter, remains very strong across many different sectors of Jews, including the non-religious ones.
Do you think that it comes at all from the idea of having been persecuted so many times and yet survived? I mean, Yes,
and you can see this in Mormons as well. It's an interesting comparison. Every Mormon child learns that their group was placed under an extermination order by a governor of a state in the late 19th century, and they compare themselves to the Jews. Of course, they call themselves a new chosen people, but they have the same sense. They've been persecuted, they survived, and you find that kind of story not just in Jews and Mormons, but in many other groups too.
We learned so many fascinating things studying the Mormons in depth, and they really do pattern the story on the Jewish story. You know, they have their Moses, they have their Exodus, they have the extermination order. It's really striking. Now, the other groups, the Chinese superiority complex is just as complicated. Everybody knows probably that there's this concept of China as the Middle Kingdom, and there was just a piece on it sort of talking about the implications of our thesis for China, the country, because it does have both, we'll get to that, insecurity and superiority, but the Middle Kingdom, the center of civilization, everybody else was barbarians. Now, when you come to the United States, I don't think that a lot of Chinese people here in America really feel that way, that I'm, from the center of the civilization. I mean, the immigrant experience is so different. But there is a sense of, certainly I grew up with, we come from the most ancient civilization. And that can be almost like an armor. When I was little, I was only Asian kid in a school, and I remember this guy was running around making fun of me, Chinese eyes, and I came home and was upset and told my mother, and she said, "Why would you care about that person? Why are you, she was just irritated. She says, we come from, this is such an ignorant person, and there's this ethnocentrism in that too. But as a young girl, it was like a shield, it was a sense of ethnic pride that always stood with me.
That was like Benjamin Disraeli's famous reply in the House of Commons to an anti-Semitic slur. Disraeli said, yes, and when the right honorable gentleman's ancestors were still living as barbarians on an unknown island, mine were in the Temple of Solomon.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's not a conscious statement, but even partially unconsciously, it's an understanding that this comes from your group and is handed down, and it's just sort of an innate part of you.
So back to the Chinese case, I wanted to finish because things change dramatically once you encounter a new society. America changes everything. And I think that a lot of the Chinese American superiority complex right now actually is related to the stereotype boost literature, which is, it's the sense that you belong to a group that is an academic achieving group. And it can actually be a lot of pressure. This is related to the whole model minority thing. A lot of people hate this idea. But you compare, and there are studies that say don't compare yourself to all those people. Compare yourself to the other Asians, And there's a well-known Persian superiority complex. People have written about it. In the Nigerian case, most Nigerian Americans here, or the vast majority, are from the Igbo or Yoruba tribe. And it turns out these are disproportionately successful groups in Nigeria with their own, proud lineage and so on.
Can I just say one thing? Just to balance out the story, what our research showed and what we want to emphasize is this sense of exceptionality. It doesn't have to be group-based. There are many possible sources of it. A parent can communicate this sense to a child it doesn't matter what group you're from. It doesn't matter what your background was. A strong parent, a strong teacher could communicate this sense of exceptionality to people, or people can find their own way to it. So just to make sure the story is complete, it's not just in these groups.
So, like a family could say, you know what, we're a smart family. We expect a lot of us as a family. We think you're going to achieve highly.
Sure.
Yeah.
But as you then go on to point out, that in isolation can be quite disastrous because you can have a very arrogant, entitled group of people who don't do much of anything except annoy the heck out of everyone. So moving on to trait 2, is this idea of individual insecurity, which is not the group, but the chip on the shoulder, as you say, that I need to prove something. And again, what comes from immigration, what comes from embedded in the culture, the religious group?
So insecurity, again, comes from so many different sources. There's, just personal insecurity. I do think that immigrants, almost by definition, are insecure. Partly just because you come to a new country, you're an outsider, you don't know if you can survive, you don't know if you can, make your children have a good life. You sometimes have an accent, you look different, people make fun of you. You're the ones that don't know where everything is and wear the funny clothes. I mean, I remember this. The Mormons, of course, are not immigrants, but they carry with them a very deep sense of insecurity related to the persecution. Even to this day, it's many Christian groups don't regard them as Christian, and it really, it's this sense of needing to prove yourself. For some of the Middle Eastern or the minority groups that we talk, or many minority groups, it comes from being a different race. So just discrimination. A good example of when this superiority and insecurity comes together and generates resentment. I mean, the Cuban case was a great one, but Nigerian Americans, they often have PhDs in their country. They may not be wealthy, but they're, have a very proud tradition. They come to this country and they run smack into American racism. And they're, stopped and frisked. They're, no matter what they're wearing, there's constantly this discrimination. And there are, quite a lot of testimonials that just creates this sense of, I want to succeed. I'm going to show everybody. I'm going to wear a better suit. I'm going to get a bigger apartment. And similarly in the case of Iranian Americans.
And then you go on to say, so, obviously the insecurity takes from the arrogance of the superiority, so it sort of tampers that. But on the flip side of this insecurity is, and you do bring this up in the book, is the fact that very insecure people can be tremendously anxious, and ongoing anxiety can cause terrible depression. You point out that Asian American teenage girls have amongst the highest rates of depression. So this, to some degree, I was going to ask you at some point, was part of your motivation for the book to, in keeping with your first book, to sort of, justify your position or explain your position of being the kind of parent or being in the kind of culture or group where you say, you do have something to prove. And I don't know if you can do it. I don't know. You're just teetering there. And the kind of anxiety and pressure and stress, because we talk about that all the time, right? Parents being concerned about the stress that their kids are under.
Maybe I'll take this because it's related to the, I don't think it's to justify. It's almost like to me, it's the same picture that I did present in Battle Hymn. That is, if people actually read it to the end, they realized that at the end, my younger daughter rebelled and it just wasn't working, and the family was almost going to fall apart, and then we pulled back and adjusted. My sister got cancer. I mean, so it's and so in a way, the book is, this is a wonderful conversation because it's been portrayed as something completely different. I see it as a new way to think about success that isn't just Pollyanna and congratulatory, that's really honest about some of the underlying pieces of that. I mean, to be driven in a way, for anyone to be driven, something has to be missing. Something has to be pushing you. And is that bad or good? I mean, that's what we want to talk about, right? I don't think we want to romanticize the opposite either, because it's not, nor is it clear that if you don't do anything that you're naturally happy. I mean, happiness is quite elusive.
So the insecurity of, or I should say the anxiety that comes with insecurity, you are sort of saying it seems to bear out that if it bears fruit, if you make success, that there's the satisfaction of that ultimately there's the satisfaction of that. Is that really what you found?
Well, I would say a couple of things about this. I'm going to get back to your question in a second, because we define insecurity as a deep feeling that who you are or what you've done isn't good enough yet. And that's painful, for sure. But I do just want to say, communicating the opposite feeling to children, a feeling of entitlement, and unjustified praise, and you can do anything you want, doesn't necessarily lead to happier kids. You're a practicing psychiatrist. I'm sure you see issues like this. So there's stuff to be said on both sides.
Yes.
But yes, it's very painful. And you know, you can joke about it. There's the famous Jewish joke of the mom who gets a call from her daughter who says, I've been elected president, you're going to come to the inauguration. She says, oh, do I have to? It's so much trouble. She says, Mom, you got to come to the inauguration. So the mother comes to the inauguration, and her daughter's being sworn in as president, and she tugs the person sitting next to her, and she says, you see that woman on the stage who's being, and the man says, yeah. She says, her brother's a doctor. And so, I mean, it's like, you know, she gets, so you know, you got to be president, but you could have been a doctor. And I'm sure she's saying of the son, you're a doctor, but you could have been president. So, like, no matter what you do, it's not good enough. And
right.
That's a painful feeling. And, you know, I think that we try to be very honest about this. And I think there is a satisfaction. I completely agree with you when it works well, but you can't ignore this other side of it.
Right. So that even with success, and I think this is true because I see these people in my office. There is sort of an angst of, you know, yeah, I've made it, but like, what's next? Or is it really good enough? Even when they've made it big. Mm-hmm. So it does. I certainly do see that. And then you talk about this third. I mean, in my mind, really the most important, actually, of the traits, but as a psychiatrist, and that is this idea of impulse control. That what you found unifying also in these groups and important to that these three have to happen together, essentially, is the idea of delayed gratification and that you'd be planning for tomorrow, really, and wait on today. One thing I wonder about that idea, which obviously we're not seeing a lot of right now, this idea of impulse control, is you talk a lot about being in the future, that it is about being future-oriented. And I think that one thing that keeps people from doing that is the anxiety that being future-oriented generates. What did you see in these groups was that an issue, or do you feel that they somehow reached this middle ground of being able to delay gratification without being overwhelmed by what's going to be?
Well, it's a fascinating question. I haven't thought about it. We've looked more at, you know, what connected all these groups, and so in a way, our finding, it was so fascinating that all these groups had this kind of unusual amounts of discipline, I would say. So even before the deferred gratification, it's also this aspect of just being able to sit down and be disciplined, much more so than mainstream America. So Mormons, obviously they can't drink, no premarital sex. The mission, they go, you know, all the 18-year-olds out there are binge drinking and partying, and they are on a 2-year mission. No movies, no dating, no magazines, no phones, working 6 days a week in a suit, getting rejected. I mean, it's really, you know, discipline. And for the other cases, I think it's more the virtue of being an immigrant. The statistics show that immigrant parents impose much stricter rules and regimens and higher expectations. So I think that the case of the Jews is so fascinating because, you know, we spend a lot of time talking about, not quite your question, but impulse control in the Jewish American population because, I mean, certainly historically, it was in some ways, well, I don't know, we have a good friend, we've had fascinating debates about whether impulse control has been a central feature. I mean, we disagree, you know.
Or not, really?
Yeah,
or not.
Yeah.
Oh.
Right. I mean, on the question you asked, you know what they say about being a partner at a major New York law firm? Here's how it's described by people and students. It's a pie-eating contest where the prize is getting more pie to eat. And the idea, what they're expressing is you work so hard, you work 12 hours a day, all those years, 12 years to make partner, and then it's like you wake up, why did I do this? Right. And that's the perhaps excessive impulse control and dedication where you maybe didn't feel like you decided what it was you were working for. You just did it because your parents told you or the site expected it of you, so you put in all this discipline and self-restraint, work toward the future, and then it wasn't, in some sense, you felt like it wasn't your decision these weren't the goals that you thought maybe you were living for or that you meant to be. And what I want to say about that is one of the things we stress the most in our book is maybe the very best thing, the ideal thing about this triple package is its ability to allow people to break from that, to write their own scripts, to break free from the expectations their parents might have had or society might have had for them. So although we focus on material success in the book because you can measure it and because it's a goal for a lot of people, this package of qualities, we think, enables people to achieve whatever kind of success they define, including the kind that's not defined by personal gain, material gain at all, but by service to others or to your community or to your country.
Did you see instances where you thought the impulse control went too far? Like the word resilience doesn't really show up so much here. And I thought that was interesting and curious because in a way, if any of these things, if you push a kid to the limit, if you're the tiger mom, if you really are the tiger mom and you're pushing and you're pushing, it sort of seems in this book that you would assume, well, it can only lead to further success in a way. But, right, we know that, first of all, there's some people that are simply more resilient than others. There are some kids that are just, biologically speaking, maybe even not going to be able to hold up under that kind of weight, whether it's depression or an eating disorder or a suicide attempt. I mean, things can go too far. So what was your...
I don't think we have the... now that I understand your question, we don't have good data or anything, but I think it's fascinating how much, of course, there's an innate quality. I've seen the studies that, individuals are just different that way. But I'm also interested in the cultural component because there's this concept in Chinese culture that pretty much everyone knows. It's called chiku, and it's called literally eating bitterness. And it's a value. And I think that's very interesting, this ability to just literally endure. And so even in the whole, if you read Jin Lee has a fascinating book on Confucianism and education, and it's about how even the studying process, the education process, I mean, maybe it's changing now, but I mean, just traditionally, involved the idea quite casually that, of course, learning is painful. Of course it's going to require pain, which is so starkly contrasted with what we, learning should be fun is the main concept now. But
although certainly Americans have, or at least have had the idea of no pain, no gain. The idea that you do.
Do you know who originally said that? It was Ben Franklin in one of his proverbs. I mean, it goes way back. In fact, all the triple package values you can find. They're traditional American values, and you find them at our founding. You find them embodied in our founding documents in our history. So it's something else.
So one thing you did talk about also is this idea that a country can have a triple package, and that to some degree our country had this triple package, at least initially in its foundations. But then you start to talk about how that can be eroded, and even within individual groups, how over generations that can be eroded. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, there's so many things to talk about. First, one of the most interesting findings in our research, that Asian American kids famously do better in their test scores and grades day, and this is not a stereotype, just a matter of fact, and it's been verified over and over all over the country. Well, then sociologists dug deep into the data, and they asked, well, what about third generation Asian Americans? And it turns out there is no difference between the academic performance of third generation Asian American kids and other American kids. That is, it dissipates the success by the third generation. Now, this punctures the whole model minority myth. It shows it's not innate. It shows it's something cultural going on in the first and second generations, something in those families, something the parents are doing, something the culture is making those, or the society, or the immigrant experience is is making those kids do. And that's what we wrote our book to look at. Can we learn from that? What's going on there? Let's not be afraid to look at that and try to learn from it. But so what our theory is that, there are elements of American culture and of the generational experience that, look, success erodes the premises, the pillars that it was built on. You get comfortable, you get less insecure. There's less reason to exercise impulse control because you're more comfortable. And so it's a very natural progress. It happens all the time in virtually every case. Success of these immigrant communities dissipates after the second generation. And so that's what a large part of our book is about. The rise and fall of groups, the traits that propel success remain the same the groups that have those traits at any particular time change, and change very much over the decades.
Now, you brought up, though, that the Jewish group maybe didn't change as much as you expected.
Well, the Jews are a little exception to what I just said.
Yeah. Because?
Well, I mean, maybe in no group in the history, in world history, is this idea of exceptionality and the experience of insecurity so built into their history. And we're talking about a millennia-old history. And that's not going to go away in a few generations. And it gets replenished. It gets replenished by worldwide anti-Semitism. It gets replenished by worldwide threats on Israel. And you know that American Jews, religious or not, identify with Israel, broadly speaking. And so there are many sources of insecurity as well as a continued sense of exceptionality. Now, I do think, to be frank, and we talk about this in our book, there is some evidence, for the first time, of Jewish decline, of American Jewish decline. Scores of young Jewish Americans on a range of academic tests and competitions, not nearly as high as they used to be.
In some areas.
In some areas. This doesn't prove anything. There are a lot of reasons why that might be so. But if it is true, I think the reason would be that Jews are getting more secure in the United States. They're pretty prosperous, and that does have a tendency to erode that feeling that you need to exercise impulse control, that you might not survive if you don't work hard. And so those things could be happening in the American Jewish community.
Well, you also point out that the group, that the affluent group is also the group that, in a way, is in decline for similar reasons. I mean, are the affluent Jews the ones that are declining when you say some are and some aren't?
Well, it's such a complex story. Yes, the answer to that question is yes, but let's not forget that, one of the poorest communities in the entire United States is Kiryas Yoel, just upstate, north of Manhattan, which is a community of Satmar Orthodox Jews. And they're among the poorest in the country. And it's not because they didn't get so prosperous that it eroded. It's because, it's interesting. It's because they're secure in their faith. They've turned their back. They don't feel they need to prove themselves to America and get wealthy and show the world what they can do. They are secure. They find security and faith in their own religion. And you see this in fundamentalist groups, not just Jews, all over America, Mormon fundamentalists, Christian fundamentalists.
The Amish is a fascinating case. Yeah.
And they're not insecure in the way we're describing, and so they're poor, but for different reasons. Yes, we find that the affluent, again, in many different communities, the Wasp Elite is a great example of this. People have been writing about the decline of the Wasp Elite for decades now, and we think it conforms to exactly the story that we found in these other groups, and it conforms to the predictions we were making.
But it could be cyclical, right? Because the decline itself can produce a new sense of needing to prove yourself. So it's supposed to be a very dynamic theory.
And you talked about this basically happening to the country, that the country is suffering from, at this point, such comfort, lack of the Cold War, lack of that also it is losing. Well, we certainly have, I think, the superiority. You comment on that Americans still, despite the numbers, despite what's going on, have a sense that we're still the best. But the insecurity and the impulse control, not so much.
Yeah, this is related to a second book I wrote, but in the 90s, we became a hyperpower. That is, when the former Soviet Union fell, for the first time, for most of our history, America has had the insecurity of being the underdog. There's some fun passages in our book about how the founders had such a chip on their shoulder vis-a-vis Europe. Jefferson sent a giant moose carcass to the French to show that we had bigger animals than Europe, and that, we wanted to show that we could produce mathematicians and poets, that we were as cultured. So most of our history we were an underdog, but once the former Soviet Union fell, for the first time we had no rival. Everybody seemed to want to be like us. And then there was the booming 80s and 90s, even though it wasn't spread to everybody. They were generally prosperous decades. So yes, we do say that we saw this erosion of both insecurity and impulse control. What's interesting is the combination of the first two qualities, superiority complex and insecurity, we see as producing this kind of chip on the shoulder or needing to prove yourself. And the idea of needing to prove yourself is exactly the opposite of being entitled. I think if you're entitled, you don't need to prove yourself. You just should get it. You feel like, why can't I just, have this? And yeah.
To put the point in the sort of starkest way, and maybe this is a bit of an exaggeration, I think history shows, we try to show this in the book, that the United States was born with the triple package values. It was born a triple package country. Something happened in the last decades of the 20th century, and by about 2000, what was left of our triple package was the superiority complex, which we still had. And a superiority complex all by itself is a recipe for swagger and entitlement. You need these other qualities to temper it, to make people feel they've still got, America has always, in my opinion, been at its best when it has had challenges and adversity. It's had hard times that it's had to rise up, prove its mettle, and overcome adversity. And in a kind of paradoxical way, the adversity we've suffered in recent years might have some promise to it. It has a silver lining, because I think it has returned to America a sense of insecurity, the unwon wars, the rise of China, and I think that might not be such a bad thing.
I just want to quickly, just because there's so much out there about the book that's not really what our book is about, there's such a fascinating section near the end that is really Jed's, it's kind of his baby, and it's a legal angle, and that is Jed has pointed out that there's a tension between the two foundational documents in this country, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And you sort of see the Declaration of Independence as embodying something we were talking about, the pursuit of happiness and living in the present, rebelling. We declare our independence. It's very much now. Whereas you see the Constitution as really the embodiment of almost like it's literally impulse control. I mean, law is impulse control. So I just thought that would be an interesting.
Yeah, well, the Constitution works by an act in which the people agrees to constrain itself by its own self-given principles, and that is an act of self-control, of impulse control. And for what reason? For the future, for the sake of the future, to build the kind of nation over generations that we were trying to build.
And written with the understanding that if we didn't do that, if we just let people run amok, right, they would do what they're doing now. Well, I mean, they would feel entitled and be corrupt potentially, right? And take from people who they shouldn't be taking from, et cetera. So it was written with the foresight of that in mind.
Very much so. The period between the Declaration and the Constitution was a period of close to anarchy, insurrections, and the language of the time spoke of popular passions which needed to be constrained. And it's that constraint of passion, that recognition that you can't just do what you most feel like doing in the here and now if you want to build a better future. Simple idea, but that's what the Constitution is based on, and in a way that's what we also see in these what we're calling triple package groups and their cultures.
So one thing that's really, when you look at this book, you think, am I going to hear about who's innately more intelligent, or who's innately has some gift in some way? And that's really not. You are actually saying to some degree the opposite, which is, it's interesting. When you think about what informs wild success, wild genius level success and so on. And you really are sort of making the case for it has nothing to do with your IQ. It really has sort of purely to do with hard work.
Yeah, and now it's not inconsistent. I mean, if it were the case that a certain group had a higher IQ, that would be consistent with a group having a superiority complex. But that's not where we go, And I love your point. I mean, it's been in some ways painful, this reaction, this kind of charges of racism. I mean, a student of mine, African American student, just pointed out, she says, I just don't get it. I mean, if you really know where the reactionary, there are people out there saying there are biological differences, and you're precisely not. I mean, your whole book is that it's not innate biological differences, and it's not even rigid cultural differences either. It's really these traits that stay the same, but the groups change over time.
And do you, you posit that within a family, you could create your own triple package, sort of, even maybe in isolation. Is that something you thought about in your family?
You know, it's so funny. Jed and I debate all the time, like whether we come from triple pack. I mean, our families are so different.
She's the classic triple package person, raised in a triple package parenting. Her mom's the true, real tiger mother. You know, I'm not so sure that I even have the triple package. Like compared to my wife, I'm a slacker. No discipline at all. I mean, I don't know in my case, but I think for our children, I don't know.
I don't know. You know what?
I mean, did you think, okay, you know, we're sort of, you know, we're Yale law professors. We have brains here. We have high achievement here. We can do this here. We expect that of you. But you know, you better. It's not coming on a platter. You know, you're going to meet this level. You better work really hard, and that means no sleepovers and no anything.
I mean,
so that you're working.
Yeah, I think for me, much more so than Jed, it's true. Like it's so interesting that embedded in the whole concept of high expectations is really both a sense of superiority and insecurity. You know, I know you can do it. You know, I know that you can be the concert master or get straight A's or whatever it is, or you know, be a wonderful writer, but you're not there yet. You know, it's both.
So you the idea, right? I have the confidence that you're capable if you put in the work to do it, and that's sort of the ethos. So it's interesting because I heard you mention that your oldest daughter is going to be in the Army.
Yeah.
So that's very interesting.
Well, we were pretty shocked to hear that, but to say the least.
So I was going to say, is that in your mind some culmination of the triple package in that there's a strategy here that she's got going, some idea that she has going on, or is this a rebellion in terms of the triple package, like, you know?
Well, I'm sure it's all those things, but I do think that in our parenting, there was a combination of things going on. The high expectations was very much a part of it. I mean, I know it's a cliche. I tried hard to teach our girls that ultimately they should not just accept what authorities said. They should challenge authority. They should challenge what people around them are telling them to think or to do. And that's what Sophia, our elder daughter, did when she said, I'm going to join the Army after my education. It shocked us. Ultimately, I know I speak for Amy too, we were incredibly proud when we got over our shock in two ways. Number one, because it shows how strong-minded and independent a young woman she is, and we're both really proud of that. But second, I'm just, you know, my dad's brothers all fought in the Second World War. Amy's family was liberated in the Philippines by MacArthur, and we just couldn't be prouder that she's, you know, made this decision to, you know, serve the country.
But to answer your question, I mean, it's actually an interesting story. When it was 2 days before she went off to Harvard, and she came in and said, "Mommy, I need to talk to you." And because I know her so well, I knew it was serious. She said, "I need to talk to you." I mean, it was that look. So of course, like any mother, you know, and I mentor all the, you know, I thought, oh my God, she's pregnant. So, you know, I said, "You're pregnant." I said, "But you know, we can deal. This is not." And she said, "No, Mommy, Mom, of course I'm not." And then just again, because I talked to my students about this, and I thought, "Oh, you're gay." And she said, "No," and it was the one thing she found that it never crossed my mind. It never crossed my mind that she would do this. And I mean, just to be honest, I was initially just terrified. I mean, my parents were liberated by MacArthur. We're huge World War, you know, U.S. Army fans too. But the safety of my own daughter, I mean, I was just completely terrified. And for me, it was when I decided it wasn't just a rebellion, was that, you know, it's been 3 years now. She has to get up at 5 in the morning. She does these drills at MIT. But I now think it's what Jed says. It's a commitment. These are her values. She's much more civic than I am. But it's part of a plan. I mean, she wants to wants to apply to graduate school. I think she's very interested in, outraged by the sexual harassment in the Army, and so that's kind of the thought that she has. But she is committed to at least 3 years after graduation, or after graduating grad school.
After graduating grad school, then she will, right. But her idea is sort of, like you said, like a somewhat politically motivated, interested with an intellectual component.
I think so. I don't. She's not planning at the moment. I mean, she doesn't have total choice. Once they can assign her anywhere. But her at the moment, it's more. It's not that she wants to go be on the front lines.
So talk about your letting go.
Yeah. yeah. I was true to my promise. I said that she could do anything after 18. And we're supporting.
Well, let me take a few audience questions here. Should we be obsessed with achievement? Are we as a society overly obsessed with achievement?
Well, I mean, I understand where this question is coming from, and it's a good question. It is a pathology of this triple package of qualities that in some cases it makes people too concerned about material success, too concerned with achievement, too concerned with external measures of your own worth. I mean, that's clear, I think, and it is a downside. On the other hand, as I said before, this same set of qualities we discuss this in our book, you find this in artists, in people who decide to be singers or movie directors. You find this in the same set of qualities in Saul Bellow and Ang Lee, the Chinese film director. They are not motivated by achievement in some kind of conventional material sense. They are taking the strengths that they got growing up and that drive, which is not always pleasant, could be painful, but they're using it to break free, to do what they want to do and not necessarily to achieve in some conventional way.
Mm-hmm. From the congregation, Beth Yam in Hilton Head, South Carolina, given the high probability of criticism of the premise of your book, why did you write it?
I don't know that I thought there was a high probability. After the whole battle hymn thing, I said, what's the next book going to be? And I said, well, I am not writing about parenting. This is going to be a research book, and if you look at the book, you saw there are 80 pages of endnotes. There's not a sentence in there that is not backed up by, it's very data-driven.
Yes.
So I guess I was overly optimistic. I mean, but I think it's extremely interesting, and we really did mean it to, I knew it would be thought-provoking, but I didn't think it would be.
Is this something you'd been thinking about for a while? This grew out of a course that you teach?
We started thinking about this book before the Tiger Mom book came out. We're both professors at Yale Law School. We started to notice some strange facts, like what's up with all the Mormon students? And it's interesting. Do we have a disproportionate number of Cuban Americans and a growing number of Asian Americans? And there were other groups, Nigerian Americans. And we thought, well, maybe, the law school is just unrepresentative. Why don't we find out? Let's do some actual research. Let's see if this can be supported with data. And it turned out it was true. And that's when we started looking. And then we started thinking, well, is there some way to try to explain this? And we were really curious about it. We didn't know. We thought maybe it would end up that there are very different cultural paths to success. It could have been, we thought for a while it was going to be that kind of book. We were surprised to find these cultural commonalities. But to specifically answer this question, I do want to say, look, as professors, if you are afraid to say something controversial, if that's a reason not to write something, you don't deserve to have tenure at university. And so I would never take the fact that something I was going to write is going to be controversial as a reason not to do it.
So you're certainly going to practice what you preach to your daughters, right?
Yeah.
Augusta Jewish community. What role does hereditary IQ play in the success of these groups?
We spend, again, we have a big footnote in there. I think it's a pretty careful treatment. We gathered all the studies, different Ashkenazi, Sephardi. And we're not the experts, but our summary of it is that it's not yet conclusive, right? So that's not part of our book.
They have been doing IQ studies for 50 years on Asian Americans in the United States, and there's actually very powerful data here. There is no difference, as yet found, no difference at all between Asian American, Chinese American IQ in the United States and white American IQ. It's the same. And yet, Asian Americans are outperforming white Americans at the same IQ level on math tests, grades, and IQ really cannot provide the answer to this. So yes, there is some evidence that Ashkenazi Jews have a higher IQ than the rest of the world. That is not conclusive. It's not been firmly established. There's some evidence of it.
The Broken Sound Country Club asks, how do you respond to charges that your conclusions are racist?
Our book is the opposite of racist. We show that there are African American and Hispanic American groups outperforming the national average, outperforming the white average. Our whole book is written to show that what's propelling success has nothing to do with race, nothing to do with skin color. It comes down to these qualities that are not innate, they're not biological, they're open to anyone. There are many, many individuals in groups, not from the groups we're talking about, who have these traits. And our president is a great example. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, someone else whom we talk about in the book, is another example. There's not a racist bone in the body of this book.
Chinese Americans, as successful as the group has been, why are so few represented at the CEO level of America's biggest companies?
I think this is part of, we have a chapter on pathologies, and one of the interesting things about the triple package is that it tends to push people towards conventional success, material success, and that's because if you are insecure and you want to prove yourself, very often, and this is I'm describing this as slightly a negative, you prove yourself by doing things that you think the community respects, by being a doctor, a scientist, or just those more stable professions. So, and that can lead to underrepresentation in more rebellious, challenging authority, breaking the mold kinds of professions. And so for us, we note this problem. And some people say, is there something inherent in the Confucian culture? I tend to think it's really this generational thing. I used to joke around that to me, the Chinese are just 2 generations behind the Jews. And you see all these young Chinese Americans now, they don't want to go into math. They don't care about that at all. They want to do, the inventor of YouTube, I think, and Guitar Hero, I think they're Yahoo, they're Chinese American. So I think it's partly generational. You break away from what your parents want.
I think there's also some discrimination at work and some.
Oh, yeah.
It's quite well documented. We talk about this in the book that it is still the case that for African Americans and Chinese Americans and other groups, it is harder for the powers that be, corporate leaders, to see them as leaders of a corporation. And so there's definitely discrimination at work. This applies to women as well. And so, of course, I agree with everything Amy was saying, but obviously, this discriminatory part goes without saying.
What are your time management techniques? How do you manage your time to do so many things successfully?
I don't manage my time. She tells me when to wake up, what to do.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm definitely the organized, more disciplined one.
We also have slightly different schedules. She gets up at 6 in the morning. I tend to be going to sleep around that time, so the overlap of our waking lives is actually very narrow.
I see. Along those lines, how did you two get to know each other, if you were not awake at the same time, and adjust in a family as 2 distinct ethnicity groups?
There's a great story that came out in the New York Times Magazine capturing exactly the moment we met, and it's actually true. We were on the Harvard Law Review in what I described as the nerdiest volleyball game in history. A Law Review volleyball game is levels below intramurals, and we both went up for a ball. Jed is a varsity volleyball player at Princeton, and I didn't even know how to play. But we both went up for the ball at the same time, and my 2 front teeth landed right under Jed's eye, and I had a bloody lip, and he had a black eye, and that was our first moment of contact.
How romantic. Wow. You mentioned income as a measure of success, since it's measurable. You include Chinese Americans on your list and not Filipinos or Japanese Americans, yet both Filipinos and Japanese Americans have a higher income on census data. How do you justify that?
Oh, there are many groups that have a higher than average income on census data. Greek Americans, Italian Americans, Japanese Americans, Filipino Americans. We couldn't write a book about them all. And as we say in the book, we picked the ones that are the largest of these groups.
Well, not largest, I mean over 100,000.
We excluded groups that were under 100,000 and whose success was the most striking on the most number of indicia. And
you might want to explain a little bit more, because it's not just the largest. I mean, we have this 3-page footnote about our methodology. So the census doesn't, there's a measure of what people describe their own ancestry, but it's self-reported. So there are some categories that are very difficult. For example, there's a British American category, and then there's an English American.
There's 1.2 million people in America who identify themselves as British, and they have actually very high incomes. Then there's like 25 million Americans who identify their ancestry as English, and they have much lower income. We are very interested in that. We'd love to, if somebody could research that and figure out what's going on there, maybe it fits into our story. But there was no way for us to get a hold of that data, so we had to just rule out those British Americans. We wish we could have written more about them, but...
Yeah. And so 2 groups that we do mention as being, having some very high income measures are the Filipino Americans, who actually would be a fascinating case. They're very, very successful, and Korean Americans. And for reasons we described, we didn't, because they were not evenly, there were interesting features about their income. For example, they're actually, I don't even want to go into it, but
you have to look at different, there's so many measures of income. There's household income, there's individual income, there's per capita, there's median and mean. It turns out that on some measures, Filipino Americans, for example, individual income measures, they don't score as high as the other groups that we are looking at. Korean Americans are a bimodal case, showing in some segments of their community exceptional success, but in others they have disproportionately high poverty rates. So the overall picture is one where the income isn't that much higher than Americans, and we didn't quite know what to do with that. We could have written a whole book about that, but we had to put that aside.
But we do, I want to say, it's very systematic. I mean, we lay out, in the census thing, here are all the groups. They're Latvian Americans, very high, but very small. So we just are excluding groups that are, if you have like 25,
right.
we're just going to pick groups over 100,000, and we excluded these groups for these reasons. So we didn't just skip any group. I mean, we really went systematically down. Otherwise, it's just straight from 1 down. I mean, Indian Americans, I think, are just number 1, and we went straight down.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that giving labels like Cuban American, African American, so on, breaks down the feeling of unity in our country?
Well, anytime you talk about groups in America, there's going to be a lot of sensitivity, and there are going to be people who jump on you, and they're going to call you names. And that's what's happened to us. And if you want to say that's provoking divisiveness, but you can't be afraid to state facts. If we've gotten to the point as a society where reporting a statistic from the United States Census is equated with stereotyping or racism, we're not going to learn anything about some of the major problems confronting us, inequality, what the true levers of success are. Mm-hmm. And if I could add just one more thing to that, it was a surprise to us. We looked at these groups. These are different religions, different skin colors, all sorts of different backgrounds, and we found a commonality. We found a commonality among them and with traditional American values. To me, honestly, I thought this is the opposite of divisive. This is unifying.
Mm-hmm. Are there policy implications to be drawn from this?
Well, it's actually quite complicated. I mean, it's not a straight how-to. It's true that, as we already mentioned, the first 2 qualities we notice in all these successful groups, disproportionately successful groups, this sense of needing to prove yourself. We've already talked about how that's the opposite of entitlement, which is what we're seeing a lot of, particularly in affluent groups. Impulse control we've talked about. Something I might mention is, we are not all about. There's one, you may all know about the Marshmallow Test, famous Stanford Marshmallow Test. That is, 30 years ago, you divided the kids in half, you told the kids if you could have 1 marshmallow now, or you can wait 15 minutes and get 2 marshmallows. And it turns out that all the kids, who could defer gratification and wait for the second marshmallow, when you followed them 30 years later, they were all disproportionately successful. Well, recently at the University of Rochester, they reran this test with a new twist. They first took half the kids and they lied to them. They broke a promise. That is, they first said, if you do this, then we're going to give you this great art set. And then they didn't deliver. And then they ran the Marshmallow Test. And then at that point, you see all the kids just grabbing the first marshmallow. Nobody will wait. And that's rational human behavior. And the point of that is that if you don't trust your institutions, if you don't, either you don't believe that somebody like you can make it in the system, or you don't believe that if you work hard and you have impulse control, that you're actually going to be rewarded, then you won't. So you know, the institutions have to support you.
Yeah, the policy takeaway there is we're not saying, when it comes to America's persistently low income groups, we're not saying, oh, they have to change their culture. The point is, America has to change, institutions have to change. That's not the book we wrote. But that would have to change to, if you were trying to grapple realistically with that problem. And so we didn't focus on that, but that's the point of this reverse marshmallow test.
Because to take the idea of the impulse control purely to the nth degree, or actually, the book insinuates to some degree you could, right? That if we all worked harder and the institutions worked harder and so on. But actually, and I don't know if you mentioned this in the book, but there are studies that look at willpower, the idea that one can, right? And really, I mean, there's a limit. I mean, or it's sort of, you can't endlessly exert willpower. You do become fatigued, and so. There's a limit to how far everyone can go, and
but it strengthens if you give people.
But practicing, right?
Yes, it's fascinating if you get people to practice any willpower increasing task, even just sitting up straight for like 20 minutes a day. It then turns out they can do all these other willpower requiring tasks better than they could before. So you get fatigued, but it also strengthens over time. From a policy point of view, I think that our book supports folks like the Nobel Prize-winning economist James Heckman, who has said that our education dollars are much better spent at an early age, pre-K age, when kids are still formable, when you can still teach motivation, perseverance, and that actually pays off big time later, as opposed to some of the spending that we're doing on, at high school and college levels, which aren't as economically effective.
It's so fascinating. I mean, we could certainly keep going, but I think I'll just conclude, and then they'll be here for the book signings to say that it seems like it would be wonderful if the next book could maybe be, because people are questioning this. What do people want? What is the end result, to some degree, right, of these groups and their successes? Is it really where we want to go, or people perceive it's where they want to go, in terms of course, we can't be happy all the time, but contentment or quality of life, and does it achieve that? Is that where we're bound, or not? Would be an interesting question, but certainly it's really fascinating, and it's so I can't believe how well researched, and so many students involved and so on. It's really a fascinating read. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much. It was really fun.